Good afternoon and welcome to ThinkTech Asia. It's Tuesday, March 17th, 2015, and I'm your host, Keith Bettinger. A little bit later on today's program, we'll be welcoming our guest, Dr. Saira Yamin from the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies located in Waikiki. Dr. Yamin is an expert on South Asia, conflict analysis and resolution, international peace and security, and state fragility and stabilization processes. Dr. Yamin and I will be discussing some topics of interest from South Asia, including the historic election last year of Narendra Modi in India and the impacts of his rise to power, the impacts that they're having domestically and also for the South Asian region in general. But before we begin our discussion, we'll have our short news summary of ongoing issues in and around Asia. So just as a reminder, if you have any Asia-related events to publicize, please contact me at keiththinktech@gmail.com. You can also send me questions or comments directly via Twitter at KCC Geography. So now on to our news summary in Southeast Asia. Let's begin here. In Malaysia, this week, Nurul Izzat Anwar, the vice president of the People's Justice Party, or Partai Keadilan Rakyat, PKR party, was detained for a speech she made in the country's parliament. Ms. Anwar, who is the daughter of opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim, spoke in parliament about the most recent charges against her father, reading a statement written by her father in which he denounced the charges in the judiciary process. Ms. Anwar was detained for allegedly violating the country's Sedition Act, which was introduced by the British colonial authorities in 1948 as a tool to crack down on local communist insurgents. The law bans any act, speech, or publication that brings contempt against the government or Malaysia's 9 royal sultans. The act also prohibits people from actions and speech seen as inflicting hatred or inciting hatred between different groups and religions, or questioning the special position of the ethnic Malay Bumiputra majority in the country. Those convicted of sedition face 3 years and in prison and fines as well. Critics of the act say that it has strengthened over the years and has been used repeatedly to silence or marginalize legitimate opposition to the country. In 2012, while still a candidate for election, Prime Minister Najib Razak said that he would repeal the Sedition Act. However, in 2014, Razak recanted on his promise to abolish the law, instead indicating that the law would be strengthened. Ms. Anwar's statements focused on the most recent round of sodomy charges pressed against her father, Anwar Ibrahim, who was once the country's deputy prime minister and who was seen as a potential challenger to the Barisan Nasional coalition of parties that has ruled Malaysia since the country's independence. Mr. Ibrahim was first convicted of sodomy in 1998, but the verdict was overturned in 2004. Then in 2008, he was charged again with trials in 2010, 2011, and 2012, eventually leading to his acquittal. In 2014, this acquittal was overturned by the Court of Appeals, who sentenced him to 5 years in jail. Now on to Central Asia. In Central Asia, Afghanistan's Deputy Foreign Minister Hekmat Khalil Karzai hinted this week that talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban will resume very soon, with the goal being to hammer out a peace deal between the government and the Taliban. However, representation from the Taliban have reiterated that they will not negotiate with the government until foreign forces are completely removed from the country. The Deputy Foreign Minister's comments echo remarks made by President Ashraf Ghani last month, who indicated through aides that talks could begin in mid-March if Pakistan was willing to support the talks. The Taliban, which used to control the majority of Afghanistan, has been fighting with the government and its allies for more than a decade. Pakistan is also said to have significant influence over the Taliban, which has used Pakistani territory since 2001 as a base from which to launch attacks against the Western-backed government in Kabul. Ghani, who was chosen as president in 2014, has worked diligently to bring the Taliban to the negotiating table. However, analysts say that the peace between the government and the Taliban is still a long way away. Now on to East Asia, where China this week became the world's 3rd largest arms exporter, eclipsing Germany. China now lags behind only the United States and Russia. According to statistics released by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, China accounted for approximately 5% of global exports between 2010 and 2014, while the United States and Russia accounted for 31% and 27% respectively. China's exports increased by nearly 150% over the period. The last time China was ranked among the top countries in terms of arms exports was the mid-1980s, when the country supplied weaponry to both sides during the long-running Iran and Iraq War. The leading buyers of Chinese military hardware include Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar, which this week made headlines by accidentally blowing up several Chinese farmers in Yunnan province. These three countries account for just over 2/3 of China's military exports. Although China's military sales are increasing, analysts say that Chinese weaponry doesn't have a major game-changing impact on military capability, and that their efforts to move into more complex platforms has proven challenging. However, the exports are a signal that China's domestic arms industry is growing, as is the fact that China slipped from first to third on the list of largest importers of military hardware. Now, on to our interview and our weekly in-depth discussion. This week, we're going to turn our attention to South Asia, focusing on relations between the world's largest democracy, India, and her neighbors. Last year, India elected a new prime minister, Narendra Modi. Modi's rise to power has sparked criticism, but many India watchers say that his policies have had a positive economic impacts on the country. However, the Modi government still faces difficulties domestically as well as abroad. Joining me in the studio today is Dr. Saira Yamin. Dr. Yamin is Associate Professor of the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu. She specializes in conflict analysis and resolution, women, peace, and security, and South Asia. Previously, she has taught at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University in Virginia and at the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad. She has worked extensively in the development sector in South Asia with local and international non-governmental organizations in building the capacities of women, children, and youth, and her policy advocacy. Her writings on the issues of peace and conflict have been published widely, including by the United States Institute of Peace, Oxford University Press, the Christian Science Monitor, the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, Nation magazine, Politico, and many South Asian journals and newspapers. Dr. Yamin has appeared as a security analyst on Al Jazeera, BBC, Canada TV, Pakistan Television, and Voice of America. So thank you very much, Dr. Yamin, for being here today. It's really a pleasure and an honor to have somebody with such diverse experience and such a noble history of work joining us in the studio. I'm really excited to talk to you today. But what we'd like to start off with, so thank you very much for being here, first of all.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I know it takes a lot of time to do this, and we appreciate you appearing on the show. So let's start off with Narendra Modi. It was a big deal when he was elected. So we're going to start off with the domestic politics of India, because it's the world's largest democracy and second largest country by population. Overall, India deserves a lot more attention than it receives in the mainstream media here in the United States. But last year was election year in India, the biggest election in the world. It's a huge event that lasts for several days. And they have incredible turnout in South Asia when they have elections. So this has been called an historic election, in the words of the BBC. The big winner of the election was the Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP party, which allowed for Narendra Modi to be chosen as prime minister. So prior to 2014, the BJP party had been a large and important party, but with a couple of exceptions, had been limited to being in the opposition. So it was a big deal then when the BJP won in a landslide in 2014, the first time, the first party since 1984 to win a majority of seats in the parliament. So can you tell us why this is such a big deal, and how the BJP was able to be so successful in the election, and what sort of mandate, if any, this huge or large margin of victory means for the Modi government?
Right. Keith, first of all, thank you once again for giving me an opportunity to come here to be part of your show and to share my views. And thank you for the great question as well regarding Modi. I completely agree with you that India deserves a lot more time in the news, and we need to talk more about this country, a very important country in many ways that you've highlighted. What Modi's win means for India, I think first of all, it signifies or it stands for the decline. What it tells us about Indian politics is the decline of a political dynasty, first of all. The Nehru-Gandhi family, the political dynasty which has no equivalent in the world. It ruled India for 2/3 of its history, of its independent history since it got independence from the British colonists in 1947. So essentially, it has ruled India for 47 out of 67 years.
Wow.
So this was, so it was a decline of the Nehru-Gandhi family, and also I believe the win signifies the manifestation of the maturation of India's democratic process, because what we really saw was the manifestation of people's disillusionment with this dynasty, the dynastic politics. For the past 10 years in particular, the Indian National Congress had been deeply embroiled in some corruption scandals. It was being blamed for economic downturn, significant economic downturn, where India had been at one point making about 9% plus annual economic, showing 9% plus annual economic growth rate, and now at some point it went down to 5%. So people were really disillusioned. There was corruption. People felt that the government was inefficient. Then there were also some cases involving rape, violation of women's rights. And so I think more than anything, it was people going to the polls, 800 million, the largest polling exercise ever in history.
Wow.
Electing Mr. Modi, who despite his controversial past, as you're aware, he's had a very controversial history because of his involvement or alleged involvement in the massacre of over 1,000 Muslims in the Gujarat massacre in 2002,
right.
Although Mr. Modi denies any responsibility. But despite that, he was elected, I believe, for a number of reasons. One, Mr. Modi represents hope. He represents the Indian dream. He was a commoner with very humble beginnings himself, the son of a tea seller.
Right.
He started his career by selling tea, taking tea to customers at a railway station, the tea stall. How he started out his career.
Right.
Mr. Modi was also 4 times elected as Chief Minister of Gujarat. And his track record in Gujarat was really impressive. He brought unprecedented economic development to the state. He demonstrated the lowest levels of unemployment in Gujarat. Foreign and national investment was very, very high. So he brought an agenda of development and economic growth. And in a country like India, which is very huge, it's the second most populous country in the world, and it's likely to surpass China within the next 10 years in terms of population. We also know that it faces challenges such as poverty and unemployment. Now, according to the UN, 42% of the people in India live below the poverty line, which is less than $1.25 a day. And half of India's population, Keith, is under the age of 25. So
Wow.
with millions of people looking for jobs annually. So Mr. Modi's performance in Gujarat offered hope to Indians, many Indians, regardless of their religious background. Many Muslims voted for him, many Christians voted for him. That said, while he won with an overwhelming margin, his government is very strong. Last month, there was a very interesting development. As you might be aware, in the state elections in Delhi, his party lost. It suffered
Right,
a
I
humiliating defeat. In fact, it only won 3 out of 70 votes, and the remaining 67 seats were won by the Aam Aadmi Party, the Common Man Party.
Right. We actually did a short story on that on this program. Yes,
right.
yes.
So as you're well aware, this Common Man Party is run by this gentleman by the name of Mr. Arvind Kejriwal, and who has been spearheading an anti-corruption campaign in India, and he's been on and off on the political scene. But it appears that people close to the close to the 1-year mark since Mr. Modi's elections are somewhat beginning to feel frustrated.
Yes.
They feel that he's not responsive enough
I see.
to their demands. There are many challenges that India faces. Some of them I've already mentioned: poverty, joblessness, but also there are questions such as the rights of minorities.
Mm-hmm.
There has been a rise in the violence against minorities in India, particularly the Muslims and the Christians.
The Muslims are a huge minority. There are more than 100 million Muslims in India. So it's not a small faction. It's a large, it's more than 10% of the population.
It is.
Correct?
There are 177 million
Wow.
Muslims. It's about, I think, India has the third largest population of Muslims in the world. So it's a huge minority. And in recent months, there has been, or since the election of Mr. Modi, there has been a campaign of mass reconversions of Muslims and Christians in India. And many many people associated with the BJP are involved in it. And since December, you may be aware, many churches and convents have been attacked. In fact, during the last few days, last weekend, in fact, a Christian school was attacked and a 71-year-old nun was gang raped.
I read about that. That was a tragic occurrence. Yeah.
And up until now, it appeared that Mr. Modi had been very silent on the rights of minorities. But he did appear to have broken his silence in this incident, and many believe it is because of his party's defeat in the Delhi state elections.
Right.
So Mr. Modi will have to do a lot more. He has been trying very hard, actually, on many levels, I would say, though I would give him credit. He is trying to boost India's economic performance, and one way of doing that is by opening up to its neighbors. As soon as he was elected, he announced the neighborhood first policy, which is significant.
The neighborhood first policy.
Neighborhood first policy, and it's very important because India is a very important player in the South Asian region, but it has not necessarily always had very good relations with all its neighbors. And while it has been trading with most of them, many of the neighbors feel that it is not the benevolent leader or the kind of state that needs to. Perhaps you could compare India to Indonesia in the ASEAN region. They often compare.
They're not playing the role that they're expected to play.
Right.
Right.
So as you might be aware of ASEAN's development.
Yes.
So with Indonesia played the role of a very generous.
The facilitator.
The facilitator, the enabler,
right.
That provided a lot of concessions and made things easier for the smaller countries in the region and they were thus able to trust it. India's smaller neighbors have in the past felt that India has overwhelmed their markets with its own goods and does not give them the concessions that they need to enter Indian markets.
Sure.
Right.
So India has this large gravity, so to speak, and it kind of pulls everybody in, but doesn't have, there's no counterforce for it. Okay, so we're going to take our first break here. Thank you. We're joined today by Dr. Saira Yamin, and we're talking about current events in the Indian subcontinent. And I guess we shouldn't say Indian subcontinent. We should say South Asia, right? It's a more appropriate term. My name's Keith Bettinger. This is ThinkTech. We'll be back in just a moment. Thank you for joining us today.
Inspired by an ancient culture, classical Chinese dance, vigorous physicality, timeless stories, 5,000 years of Chinese music and dance. Shen Yun presents authentic Chinese culture. Coming to Blaisdell Concert Hall, May 8th and 9th. Tickets at shenyun.com or call 808-792-3919.
Hi, my name is Andrew Howard. I'm an astronomer at the Institute for Astronomy at the University of Hawaii up in Manoa. I'd like to tell you about the annual open house that we're having. This year it is on April 6th 11 to 4 p.m. It's an all ages event, kids, grown-ups, even people in between, everyone is welcome. We have a lot of really fun activities. You get to meet astronomers, look at yourself in an infrared camera, play with Legos, make robots, look at videos. You can even make some of the kids like to make comets out of gravel and snow. Even adults like to do that too. You'll be able to look at the sun with a solar camera safely. It's really a great activity. We do this every year in April, and I hope to see you this year. Thanks.
Okay, welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. My name is Keith Bettinger, and it's Tuesday, March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. So happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone. Today we're talking about India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and the South Asia region. And I'm very, very delighted to be joined by Dr. Saira Yamin today. And we'll continue our discussion. When we left off, we were talking about the election of Modi and the elevation of the BJP party to supremacy in India, and how the honeymoon seems to be over a year on for Modi in some places. You mentioned that he lost the Delhi elections and like that. And so we're talking about some difficulties that he's had, but also minorities. And so the question that I want to raise, and you've spoken to this a little bit already, does the victory for the BJP party raise any concerns for the country's 100 million Muslims? I understand that the BJP party is rooted, their political philosophy is rooted in, here we see their party emblem, is rooted in Hindu nationalism. And India is a majority Hindu state, but like we said earlier, there's 177 million Muslims. Right. And there are Jainis, there are Sikhs, there are all sorts of groups in India. It's a very pluralistic society. So this Hindu nationalism, and you alluded to Gujarat, the violence in Gujarat in 2002 earlier, in which Modi was implicated, but never formally connected to. Right. And he denies connections to that violence. But that was sectarian violence. That was Hindu versus Muslim violence, and it went on for a long time, back and forth. So the BJP party's victory, what does it mean for plural society in India?
That's a great question, Keith. And as you mentioned, Muslims are a huge minority in India. And when Mr. Modi was running for elections, given his alleged involvement in the Gujarat massacre by virtue of not stopping the massacre against the Muslims, he was accused of being culpable or being guilty. Now those are some allegations against him, but also the Muslims who live in the Gujarat state, they feel that they have also been marginalized from being beneficiaries of the development of the state.
Of Modi's development when he was the chief minister for
right.
4 terms.
Right. So there is some evidence that Muslims living in the state, the standard of life of Muslims in the state is not on par. In fact, it is very, very, it is very low compared to others.
Can I ask a question there to clarify a little bit? In Gujarat, the Muslims and Hindus, are they geographically dispersed, or is it so? Are there different areas that the different groups live in, and so is that how you would find lagging development, or are they integrated within the same?
Right, and that's my sense, that they are geographically dispersed.
I see. Right.
So they have different communities, different townships where there's concentration of Muslims, and where they feel that they
So it could be simply a question of one township being budgeted a certain amount of money and another township not receiving it. I see.
Something along those lines. That said, when Mr. Modi was campaigning for elections, many Muslims did vote for him because they felt that he was going to bring in economic development. He had an agenda that prioritized economic development. And I believe that he may have been very sincere.
Yes.
But as we know, that his party is a Hindu nationalist party, and they believe in the preservation and sort of predominance of Hindu culture, Hindu ideology, and so minorities have been threatened by the outlook of many of the members of the BJP. For instance, in the last week, a senior leader of the BJP, Dr. Subramaniam Swamy, stated that gods reside in temples, not in mosques and churches. He also said that mosques are not religious buildings. They can be demolished at any time.
Right.
So statements such as these are very unsettling for the Muslims. And
So just to be clear, India, under its constitution, is a secular state, is it?
it is a secular state,
Yeah.
and the Indian National Congress is a secular party. But even then, many Muslims in India are very marginalized. So you know, you're aware of a caste system in India, for
Right.
instance, right? Where you have the Dalits, who are the untouchables, and which is the lowest caste.
Right.
Now, the Indian government has done a lot to bring them up to par, you know, giving them more opportunities, improving their conditions, and they have done a lot. But in a research done by some professors at Stanford, sorry, not at Stanford, but at Princeton University a few years ago, it was discovered that in the corporate sectors, the likelihood of a Muslim finding a job is even less than an untouchable, than a Dalit.
Wow, wow. And that's because just discrimination.
It is because of discrimination.
Wow.
So this, and while India is trying to improve its structures and institutions, I believe that the vast majority of Muslims do not still today have the same opportunities that Hindus
So
would
when
have.
you mention the Dalits, the untouchables, the lowest caste in the Hindu caste system, and you mentioned that the government there's been a lot of outreach, and I know that in the early days of the Indian Congress, the caste system was disavowed by Gandhi, for example. And some of the other leaders said that this is not part of the future of India. This is not something that we can do, but it still kind of lingers. And it's hard, it's thousands of years old. It's hard to make that go away even in decades. But the efforts that the Indian government has put forward to lift the Dalits up, would you characterize those as affirmative action types of policies?
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's proactive development for this group of
Yes.
people. Have there been similar programs for Muslims or not?
Not that I'm aware of.
Is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
And the Dalits, the untouchables, have benefited a lot from some of these affirmative action plans. But at the same time, the caste system is deeply entrenched in
Sure.
Indian society.
Right.
So you may see the Dalits a lot improving in urban centers, but in rural areas, in remote areas, in villages, they are outcasts. They are
Right.
still outcasts, right?
Right.
And they don't have equal opportunities. So India does have a long way to go. And remember, it's a huge country with more than 1.2 billion people.
Sure.
So and even though the government has also put in place a lot of poverty alleviation programs, and there has been a rate in the decline of poverty, which impacts the Dalits, of course. In terms of absolute numbers, the number of poor people in India is actually on the rise.
It is.
It is.
Wow. Wow. Well, that's very interesting. So that's one of the challenges that Modi's government will have to face, is this not just short-term economic development, but the longer-term outlook. One of the things that you said earlier that really struck me is that you said that more than half of the country is less than under 25
Right.
years of age.
Yes.
And so more than half of the population is currently looking for opportunity,
Sure.
looking for livelihoods, looking for ways to raise their families, to find a place in society, or they soon will be. And that's a real challenge for any society to deal with. In other cases, for example, in Iran and some even say in Syria, and the current violence that we're seeing associated with the Arab Spring, a lot of that has to do with the demographics of the country. There's so many young people, and the government just can't keep up with providing education, providing economic opportunities for these people. So that will be something that that India will have to deal with, and Modi in the years going forward. Now, are there other challenges that he faces other than besides what we've talked about? Before we get into the international affairs aspect are there other domestic challenges that he needs to overcome?
Yes, of course. You know, one of the reasons for the downfall of the Indian National Congress party was the corruption scandals. You know, the Indian government, the institutions, the bureaucracy has been deeply embroiled in many corruption scandals. So that is something that, you know, Modi needs to fix.
Is it political corruption or is it embedded within the bureaucracy? For example, my work is in Indonesia, and the corruption in Indonesia is embedded in the bureaucratic system there. Is it the same in India? Is it expected that people will pay bribes to receive government services?
It is expected, but
Yes.
it is looked down upon also,
is that right?
And so because India does have a growing middle class, so the level of awareness is very high, and because its democracy is evolving, accountability is also increasing.
So people are willing to challenge this.
People are willing and able to challenge
Wow.
the government, right? So, Mr. Modi is trying very hard, and he for instance, started an austerity campaign. On another front, he started toilet campaign because
that's a huge issue.
Right, that's a
Yeah.
huge issue because I believe more than half of India's population does not have access to toilets, and they defecate out in the open, which means that you know the likelihood of disease and epidemics is very
increased.
right.
Yes. Yeah, that's an issue that I've read a lot about over the past 2 years, and most people I think don't understand how big an issue hygiene and just the availability of closed toilets is, how important that is,
Right.
and how much you can improve human livelihood just by providing these basic
Right.
services.
Right.
And I understand they've made a lot of progress, but there's a long way to go.
Right.
Um,
And if I may, Keith, there's
Yes.
another very burning issue or challenge that faces Mr. Modi, and that's the treatment of women.
Yes.
Women's rights, and you know it's been in the news lately.
Especially with the release of this film. That's just come out.
Especially with the
Yeah.
release of this film. So that is going to be a serious, should be a priority for the Modi government. It hasn't been thus far.
Right.
But he will need to address it,
Sure.
this issue, and provide more protection to Indian women. The Indian women's movement is quite strong. They have quite a strong lobby, the civil society, you know,
Right.
they're quite active.
Right.
So there will be more pressure on the Indian government to do more.
Right. Okay, that's great. Now we're going to take another break. When we come back, we'll talk about the international dimension of India's relations with her neighbors. Thank you very much for joining us here at ThinkTech Asia. My name is Keith Bettinger, and we'll be right back.
Aloha, Yappers, and a Happy New Year. I'm your host, King Zilly. From inner city out to the platform and now on the Yap Show. It's a new year, and most would say a new beginning. So this is a call to action. As we promote tech, energy, diversification, and globalism, with ThinkTech Hawaii, the Yap Show is all about advocacy for effective leadership, comprehensive youth policies, programs, and access to knowledge and information for upward social mobility, especially for the historically underprivileged youth. This means we'll be looking at young people making a difference in their community, youth policies here in Hawaii, the country, and the world. We want to highlight youth programs that are meeting young people where they are, working together to accomplish a goal or tackle an issue while providing information and access to free educational content for anybody looking to learn on their own time, study for an exam, or simply refresh their memory. We do this by inviting everyday people like yourself, state policymakers, youth advocacy groups, youth programs, professionals, and so forth. But most importantly, we'll be partnering up with my new organization, causeeffect.org. More information on Cause Effect, as this website is currently in development and hopes to feature courses, seminars, tutorials, and conducting surveys that will be featured on the show. As we leave behind 2014, I wish I could say we leave behind issues such as police brutality, youth violence, education, economic mobility, and so many other hot-button topics that made 2014 a difficult year. So what does it mean for the new year? What does it mean for youth policy? What does it mean for Hawaii as a whole? And most importantly, how does it affect you and your community? We want you to tune into the YAP show at 3 p.m. Friday and find out. Aloha.
All right, welcome back to ThinkTech. Asia, my name's Keith Bettinger, and it is March 17th. It's St. Patrick's Day. And so I hope you'll put off your St. Patrick's Day plans for another 15 minutes or so while we finish our discussion of South Asia. I'm joined today by Dr. Saira Yamin. And we've been having a really fruitful discussion about domestic affairs in India. What I'd like to do now is shift towards the international dimension of India's relations with her neighbors in South Asia. As you mentioned earlier, India is kind of they're the big weight in South Asia. And there have been some tensions between India and some of her neighbors. So let's first talk about India and Pakistan. This is the one that people know about. And maybe they know about this relationship for the wrong reasons, or maybe they've drawn conclusions because they don't know very much about the root of the conflict between India and Pakistan. But most people are familiar with the fact that there's ongoing issues between these two countries centering on Jammu and Kashmir. Which are two disputed states in the northern part of India and the northeast of Pakistan. In fact, there was a fairly recent exchange in January involving gunfire and artillery this year, and several soldiers and civilians were killed in this most recent outbreak of violence. But I don't think that most people really understand the genesis of this conflict and why it's so intractable. Why it hasn't been solved, why it's been going on for decades and decades. So first of all, could you tell us briefly about the origins of the territorial dispute and how these two states have experienced the transition from colonial rule to independence? And yeah, let's start with that.
Keith, again, a very good question. India and Pakistan have had a very tenuous relationship. And many analysts argue that these states were born fighting when they got their independence from Britain in 1947. And one of the core reasons they were born fighting was the unsettled issue of Kashmir. Who was the rightful, who had the right, which country, which state Kashmir belonged to, India or Pakistan, and this issue remained unsettled, and it is still unresolved, and it remains one of the world's longest unresolved disputes. And it's important because India and Pakistan are both nuclear states, and they have contiguous borders, and so Kashmir is known as a nuclear flashpoint. In fact, when former President Clinton visited the region in 2002, he dubbed Kashmir the world's most dangerous place because of this unresolved issue. And India and Pakistan have been to war several times, 3.5 times, and 2.5 times it has been over Kashmir. So it is.
Where's the half come from?
The half comes from, well, limited warfare. It was the most recent one, the Kargil incursion that you may have heard about by Pakistan into Kashmir, which was also very controversial. But they went to they've had two full-scale wars over Kashmir, and the matter remains unresolved. The outcome of the war has been the drawing of the line of control by the United Nations. And so there's, the Kashmir is now divided. About, I would say 35% is controlled by Pakistan, or a bit less. The greater part of Kashmir is controlled by India, and a small part is also controlled by China. Which is claimed by India. So it is really a very, very troubled region because all these three countries are nuclear states.
Sure. What is about Kashmir that makes it so desired by all three of these states? Is it natural resources, or what?
Natural resources, water, access to water. But for India, I think it also carries a lot of symbolic significance. You might be aware that there are several secessionist movements underway in India. There have been other threats to India's internal security, such as the Maoist movement, the Naxalite movement, which has been underway since the 1960s. Then India's northeastern states have been restive, and there have been a number of secessionist movements. So I believe that for India, in many ways, letting go of Kashmir could have meant a sort of a domino effect,
Sure.
right? A
Right.
contagion to on other.
Well, letting go, does that mean letting go in terms of becoming an independent state or being ceded to
Either
to
way,
Pakistan? All right.
either way, because at the time of independence,
Mhm.
the majority of the populace in Kashmir, at least at that time, wanted to be part of Pakistan because
Right.
they were majority Muslims.
Mhm.
And that's how the fate of the rest of Pakistan was decided, that the majority Muslim areas would go to Pakistan, majority Muslim states or provinces.
Right.
And the ones that did not have a majority of Muslims would remain part of India. That's how it was partitioned. Now, Kashmir was one of those states which had a majority Muslim population, but its ruler was a Hindu,
Right.
right?
And the ruler chose to go
Right.
to India.
Eventually, yes. He wanted, it remained independent for a while, and then there was an insurgency in Kashmir. There were, in fact, many tribals from Pakistan also supported the insurgency.
When did that take place?
That was soon after, the year after independence, right?
So after partition,
After
after,
right.
1947.
Right.
Right.
And at that time, the Hindu ruler, the Dogra Raja, asked India for help. And according to one narrative, it is believed that India then asked the Raja that if he wanted support, then he should accede to India.
Sure.
So he signed the papers, and that's when he signed the papers to accede to India, and that's when a war broke out
I
between
see.
India and Pakistan, and then
So
there
the
was
first war was in the late 40s
right.
between the two countries.
Right.
And then one war was in the 60s, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right.
And then they fought again in the 70s.
71.
I
Yes.
think. So yeah, that's very interesting. So it's about natural resources. It's about India fears this domino effect, which we see in a lot of countries that are
Right.
that are federal states or that are unions of a lot of different places. So what's the status now on the border region? I know that there was fighting in January and shelling back and forth. I haven't seen anything in the past month or so, and I'm curious as to whether or not it's because there hasn't been any activity, or whether it's because the media is kind of dull to this low level of violence that is almost perpetual between the two countries.
Well, you're right. India and Pakistan have, perpetually experienced border skirmishes, but they signed a ceasefire agreement in 2003.
Oh, right.
Which was violated actually in 2013 after, maybe 10 years of a lull, a fairly effective lull between the two countries. And so what you are referencing, what happened, the exchange of fire earlier this year in January was probably the peak of that exchange of fire. It had been underway for a number of months, over a year actually.
Right.
So, and India and Pakistan's relations ebbed to a new low because of this exchange of fires, and both countries blamed the other for instigating and initiating this exchange. India has been blamed by Pakistan for using disproportionate force
Sure.
against Pakistan. There have been, casualties and injuries on both sides, and there has been displacement, significant displacement. Thousands of Kashmiris have fled their homes in January. We have seen de-escalation of this pattern, this exchange in recent months, and earlier this month, in fact, the Indian Foreign Secretary, Mr. Shankar Subramaniam, also visited Pakistan. He was actually on a tour to SAARC countries. SAARC, as you know, is the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation,
Right.
comprising of 8 countries in the region, including India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Bhutan.
Bhutan, all right.
So he was essentially visiting all these countries, and Pakistan was one of the countries on his tour. But this was significant because a few months ago, foreign secretary level talks between India and Pakistan were cancelled.
Wow.
because of Kashmir, because of the tensions
That
on
was
Kashmir.
this year,
Well,
2015 or
last year.
Was it 2015?
Yeah, about 6-7 months ago.
I see.
So India and Pakistan have a lot of issues to address, Kashmir being one of them. India alleges Pakistan of providing covert support, or even overt, if you would say, support to some of the terrorist groups that have in the past orchestrated major terrorist attacks in India, such as Mumbai.
Sure. Yeah, I
Mumbai.
remember that. That's still a kind of an unresolved, the future of security between the two countries. Now, it looks like that we could go on forever and ever
Right,
about this. But unfortunately, we're out of time for today's program. So we didn't get to talk about Sri Lanka, we didn't get to talk about Bangladesh, and we didn't get to talk about some of the other pressing issues. So the way that we usually solve that problem is we invite you to come on the program again. So hopefully we'll be able to have you on again to deepen our discussion of South Asia. But that's it for ThinkTech. So thank you very much
Would
for
love
joining
to.
us.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
That's it for ThinkTech Asia this week. Thank you for joining us, and I hope I think we've learned a lot. I want to express a special mahalo to my guest, Dr. Saira Yamin, for taking the time to be here today. Also, I want to express my appreciation to Jay Fidel, Zuri, and Sachi for making this show possible. We hope you'll join us again next week at 4 p.m. on Tuesday for ThinkTech Asia. Mahalo, aloha, and ahui ho, and happy St. Patrick's Day. Goodbye.